Hi y'all, Kraken Latte here. Welcome to a new mini-series where I cover my results from leveling through each zone in World of Warcraft. This data is being collected in order to make my new leveling guides. As you can imagine, going through each zone in WoW, sometimes even twice due to faction differences, is going to take a while. So, in the meantime, I'll share my findings with you. Since the process of leveling was changed in 9.0, including the introduction of Chromie Time and the removal of heirloom buffs, zones give different results than before, and that's why I'm redoing them all. I'm not going to repeat the ground rules again so as not to bore all of you who saw the first episode. If you haven't seen it though, please go watch that so you can understand my results and not wonder why yours may look different. Let's get right into it. Alright, so the first zone we're going to start with is actually Blade's Edge Mountains. This is the only zone in Outland I found to be truly contested, as it did have different quests for the first half of the zone for the two factions. So, for Alliance, I went from 20 to 31 in 250 minutes, and for Horde, I went from 20 to 30 in 210. You can see it is fairly similar there in the levels, but the first half of the zone is quite different for the two factions, and that's why there's actually quite a bit of a time difference. The Alliance, I believe, did actually have more quests, and that extra level is not chalked up to having a slight difference in the War Mode buff, because a whole 5% actually makes a lot less of a difference than you'd think. So because they have Tashley's Station, and they just have different stuff than the Horde does, I believe. It felt like they had more. It certainly took longer. And then the Horde obviously had a little bit less, but it was, 40 minutes faster. So pretty good zone for what it is. Not great in its time. That's, 3 to 4 hours right there. That's pretty long. So let's move on. And next we have the faction-neutral zone of Hellfire Peninsula. This is basically the starter zone for Outland, since it's the zone you land in after the Dark Portal. So, for Alliance, we have 10 to 25 and 256 minutes, and then Horde has a very similar result of 10 to 25 and 263. So, despite the two factions having some different quests, they are very, very similar in results, and almost identical in the level range there. I did keep track of Falcon Watch and Telhamut, the quests on the far western side, since those are a good chunk that I used to use to get a few extra levels in my old leveling guides. And specifically in that area, I went from 21 to 25 in about 68 to 70 minutes for both factions. So it's not great anymore, even at higher levels. Those 4 little measly levels would jump down to nearly nothing after you hit past 30, so not great anymore. Still the best part of the zone, ironically. So if you're going to do any part of Hellfire Peninsula, just do the Falcon Watch or Telhamut areas, if you want, speed. Next up, we have the faction-neutral zone of Zangarmarsh. This is another zone that I used to use as a good intermittent leveling zone in my old guides. Let's see how it fared now. I went there at the earliest possible, which is now level 10. There isn't a jump between Hellfire and Zangarmarsh anymore. It is level 10 zone. So, as Alliance, I went from 10 to 20 and 172, and as Horde, I went from 10 to 20 and 152. So very similar results, but the Horde and Alliance do have slightly different quests. So there's a very slight time difference there, but the results are basically the same. Is this zone still good? I personally don't think so. I didn't bother going into the 30-40 ranges because I barely got 10 levels, even in the 10s range, which that's the range that you're going to get the most XP out of. And those times, even if I dropped it down to 100 minutes, the levels would likely drop to like 6 and 4, and it would just not be great. So, no more Zangarmarsh. I mean, I still love the zone. It's gorgeous. I love mushroom landscapes, but besides the aesthetics and maybe, pounding out some quick, not so quick few levels, it's not what it used to be. So, that's okay. Next, we have the faction neutral zone of Nagrand. For Alliance, I went from 20 to 31 and 215, and for Horde, I went from 20 to 32 and 210. Now, the quests are extremely similar here, but the Horde does get a little bit more on their side, and so they actually came out on top with one more level over the Alliance, and that is despite the Alliance having 5% higher of a war mode buff. So, I still left this as faction neutral because it's almost identical in time, down to almost the minute, which was pretty funny, but the Horde does win out on the Nagrand zone here, which kind of makes sense considering orcs and all, I suppose. So, there's that. Now we have the faction neutral zone of Terokkar Forest. For Alliance, I went from 20 to 30 and 232, and for Horde, I went from 20 to 30 and 246. The quests are virtually identical, down to almost every single one of them, and it just comes down to your luck with RNG, because this zone, I really personally don't like it because it's a huge mess of crazy mob grinds and fetch quests, like 30 Alemba seeds, collect all these feathers, collect all the eyes, but I mean stuff with lots of RNG attached to it. A lot of the items like that you can actually buy off the auction house, because that's kind of from that era, but they're usually really expensive, so kind of what's the point for that unless you really want to spend the gold. So, not great. Terokkar Forest was not great, but that's okay. The landscape is beautiful, and Outland is pretty cool. But, moving on. And next we have the faction-neutral zone of Shadowmoon Valley. This zone does not have great results, and actually I think is the worst of the bunch in Outland, but let's look at the results and see why. So for Alliance, I went from 30 to 36 in 182 minutes, and for Horde, I went from 30 to 36 in 216. So that's 6 levels, and I was in the 30s because you can't be there until 25 because it is one of the 2 end zones in Outland, so I chose to be there at 30. And you don't get a lot out of it. There is not as many quests as you would think there should be in Shadowmoon Valley, and a lot of them are kind of difficult. Lots of elites roaming around, and there are a good handful of quests that require a group. Now, a lot of quests in WoW, as you may have noticed, may say they need a group, but you could probably solo it. Like, I don't usually have a problem with those kinds of quests. However, that's not the case in Shadowmoon Valley. You need that group, at least a friend or two to be able to down these quests. And since we cannot use the group finder for forming groups until level 50 now, I could not do these quests. Even on a Warlock or a Vengeance Demon Hunter, those were a no-go. And there was like at least 6 of them, possibly more, because I don't know what was after those, if any. So, you might be able to hit 37 if you can do those, but it's kind of not worth your time. So, that's Shadowmoon Valley. I'm a little disappointed because I really like the zone. I used to level here a lot, and I think this one got hit really hard in the scaling, so that's a shame. And for our final zone in Outland, we have Netherstorm. This is a truly faction-neutral zone because it does not have different faction hubs. It is just Area 52 with all the neutral goblins and ethereals and all that, so I only had to do this one once, thankfully. So, for the test here, I went from 30 to 41 in 262 minutes. So you can see a far cry better than Shadowmoon Valley if you had to pick between the 2 end zones. Definitely do Netherstorm. And it works well because you probably would go there after Blade's Edge anyway, since Blade's Edge wants you to go there after you've finished that. So, Netherstorm's pretty good, not too shabby, and yeah, it's definitely pretty good for that range actually, because 11 levels in the 30s range isn't terrible, even though the time is atrocious. So, now inside Netherstorm, I used to use the Mage Village area of Kirin Var, as an intermediate way to get a bunch of extra levels back in my old guides before the level squish. So I did keep track of that area specifically to see what I got out of it. And in this range, I went from 33 to 36 in 49 minutes, which isn't terrible. That's actually pretty good for that range. I mean, it's not amazing, but you do get 3 levels in, a good under an hour. And you could probably do it faster if, you optimize yourself. So that's not too bad. I wouldn't go out of my way to go all the way up there, but, it didn't get hit as hard as Zangarmarsh or Hellfire did, so that's pretty good. So that was all the zones in Outland. What do I think about them? I think they're terrible. I'm sorry. If you like questing here, I enjoyed it for the most part, because it's nice scenery. The characters here are pretty neat, but as far as the times are awful, and I don't mess around, when it comes to questing. I'm pretty quick about it, so, those times could be even worse if I wasn't paying attention. But the results from the levels themselves, because these are all 10s and 20s with the exception of the 2 30s, those are really terrible results for those level ranges, honestly. You're looking in 20 to 30, minutes per level in some zones. And I'm kind of impressed with how terrible it is actually. So, if you're trying to speed level, don't do Outland. But if you want to level just for fun or for nostalgia or whatever, then, go for it. But I unfortunately did not find anything great out of Outland, which may or may not be a plus to some of you. I know you probably didn't entirely care for my random Falcon Watch or Kiranvar or Zangarmarsh from my old guides, because they were necessary evils back in the day, but they're not anymore, so we don't have to think about Outland unless you want to. So, Outland, Dunzo, huzzah, no more of that. Moving on to next week, I will have Northrend out. I'm going to be doing Northrend. I've already got a couple zones done in it, so you will see that next week. I was in the middle of doing Warlords of Draenor, but I got frustrated with some of the stuff in there because I have to do each zone several times, different ways, because of all the factors that go into it. For some reason, Warlords of Draenor can be complicated if you start actually dissecting everything that goes into it. So, anyways, Northrend next week. I hope you enjoyed this. This was a lot of work this week. This one actually I wanted to put out last week, but it took me 2 weeks to do because each zone took, 3 to 5 hours, and that's, a good half of your workday. So, yeah. Anyways, enough rambling about that. Outland is done. Northrend next week. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, remember, it's never too latte.